And I think that 9/11 was a defining moment for probably most nations around the world, because it wasn't just about a terrorist attack. It was about where you stood. You know, the iconic, incredibly tragic and brutal words of George W. Bush back then ring true till now. And they went far in defining where people stood. You are either with us or you are with the terrorists.
Dr. Anas, so lovely to have you with us. Thank you
It's a
so much
pleasure
for coming
being
in.
here. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, Razan.
Not at all. Dr. Anas, you are the CEO and the founder of the Cordova Foundation. But before we get there, I want to take a massive leap back to when you were 2 years old, the first time you came to the UK and settling here. So you came here with your family, with your father, who was a major political figure in Iraq. Can you tell me more about how that experience alone shaped the course of your life, which we will then eventually get into?
It was a major factor in how I became. It was the discussion around the dinner table. It was, the games that you used to play with my father, for instance, when we were little. It was the trips that we had. It was the kind of songs that we sang when we were driving up to meet with other Iraqis or other members of the Muslim community back then, which was quite scarce. The Arab Muslim community back in the 70s, you had to travel for, sometimes hundreds of miles in order to go and meet a family from Syria or from Libya or from Iraq or from Palestine. Everything was shaped by who my father was and his cause. And of course, my father had left Iraq hurriedly because as someone who belonged to the Islamic movement under the Ba'ath regime, it was unsustainable. So before the house was raided, literally hours before the house was raided, he managed to leave the country. And as a doctor, he came under the guise of getting his fellowship in radiology, which he did. But the main reason why he left Iraq was essentially political, and that shaped everything. It made me, well, firstly, the people who came and visited were people who were quite prominent. Yeah. All the exiles, all those who had left their countries, respective countries around the Arab and Muslim world, in order to pursue their goal, their objective, they came to our house. The kind of books that we had in the library, even the calls back home with my uncles, with my aunts, we had to be very, very careful because all the calls were monitored. So what we say, what we don't say. The fact that we weren't supposed to say my father met this guy or we went to this particular place or the such, that kind of sense of discretion, let me say, was instilled in us at a very early
stage. Did you feel like you were leading two lives at one point, particularly when you were younger?
To
be honest, you had to downplay who you were or who your father was?
To be honest, it wasn't because of this. If there was at any stage a sense that I was leading a double life, was because marrying the Muslim identity with the little boy who wanted to be part of the kind of life that my friends were. I think that was the most difficult part to bridge by the age of, let's say, between 9 and 12. That was the most difficult part. But apart from that, I think myself and my siblings, we handled that kind of context that we were thrown into. I think we handled it quite well. And it didn't cause us any major mental or physical or psychological disruption. So I think that from that point of view, I think it added to who we were. It added to our understanding, our context, our perspectives, our intellect, maybe even. So generally speaking, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to Allah. I'm grateful to my father for who he was and how he brought us up.
So Dr. Anas, you spoke previously just now about all these different exiles from their respective countries coming and visiting you. Did you feel like you were part of an extended exiled community and exiled for very particular reasons? And the reason why I ask you this is because I think I relate to an extent. Of course, I'm much younger. I think I'm either two generations younger than you are. But my parents also came to the UK for their own political reasons, and we were brought up. Even though by the time I was brought up, we had an established Muslim and Arab community. There was the Iraqis, there were the Palestinians, but they weren't the Syrians. And so I think, as Razan, I always felt alienated. I always felt like I was completely different. I was part of the Palestinian community, but I wasn't Palestinian. I was part of the Egyptian community, but I wasn't Egyptian. But then when people did come together, there was this sense of, we are exiled for a common cause. Sometimes that common cause wasn't necessarily common, but the fact that we were exiled made it common, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Did you feel the same thing, or was this...
To an extent, to an extent. I mean, there wasn't anything there that I felt disrupted my life. I think that I enjoyed, my surroundings. I enjoyed the opportunities that came my way. And I didn't feel that that particularly had an impact. And I think it led to something else happen in my life and in my own behavior and the way that I speak and talk and address and think about things, is that it, to an extent, diluted my Iraqiness.
Okay.
To an extent where, those around me were essentially from Sham, from Palestine, from Lebanon, from, when I was in my teenage years, most of my friends were Syrian, for instance. So I had this knack of speaking in various Arab dialects. I could knock down a Syrian and as well as an Egyptian and Lebanese and the such. So I think that it led to that. Now, in terms of understanding the context from which we all emerged, the biggest problem for us, and as a result of my father being a doctor in his early years before he became, he had his fellowship in radiology, he had to move every couple of years from one place to another. So we never settled enough to create a real bed of friendship.
Okay.
And we're always going to new schools. We're always getting to know new people. We're always getting to face new challenges. For instance, one of the places where my father landed was in Birmingham. And Birmingham was, many of my friends were Asian. And we could share stories about how going to the Quran weekend school or learning broken Arabic or the such. And then we moved to the Northeast, Newcastle, where I was the only non-white kid in the class. And I had my very first experience, which I understood. I'm not entirely sure whether it happened before or not, but at least I understood bullying and racism, and I saw it. I actually saw it. I was, even the teacher, as kind and as generous and the such, but still there was, the kind of terminology, the kind of was used, and I was very, very much aware of that. There was literally no non-white kid other than myself, and in a younger class, my sister. And I think that added another element to the whole thing. So probably that, the scarcity of the Muslim community back then, and I'm talking here about the mid-70s to the late 70s. I remember, for instance, my father every now and then would let me not go to school on Friday so that he could take me to Friday prayers. And we would drive for something like 45 minutes in order to get to the nearest mosque or Islamic center. So I think that was what shaped my awareness, the fact that I was a Muslim, and as a kid you don't think about whether you belong or don't belong. You don't get those feelings until much later, until your teenage years. So I think that was what shaped, and the fact that I knew that we had friends who spoke Arabic, who were like us, who were also exiled, but that we needed to spend an entire weekend traveling all the way across the country and then back in order to see them, and that happened every few months or the such. So I think that was the kind of reality that we were thrown into and we had to deal with. Generally speaking, it's not a sob story by any stretch of the imagination. I think it was a good upbringing. It was quite healthy. Yes, it might have burdened us slightly more than our young shoulders could carry. It made us mature, probably earlier than our peers. But all in all, it's something that I look back now and I'm grateful for.
Was there a sense of, I'm not sure if I should say, was there a sense of obligation or duty that you felt back to the homeland that is Iraq, or to your father's homeland, whether that was instilled in you? I'm not sure who the actor is here, but did you at any point, and I'm talking about your younger years, not necessarily now, feel like you had a sense of duty to the country that your parents came from, and which treated your parents unjustly?
It was made quite clear to us that we're here just for a short time, and then we're heading back to Iraq.
Okay.
And that became quite a running joke in our household between us siblings, because, every time, for instance, the dining table broke. Oh, shall we get a new dining table? No. Next year we'll go back to Iraq, so there's no point. The car's broken down. Shall we get a new car? No. Next year we're going back to Iraq. So this became a running joke that next year we're going back to Iraq. Nothing matters. We're going back to Iraq. And I remember my mother, God bless her. She was forever planning for the trip back to Iraq. And she had this huge chest, which I don't think you can find in any flea market today, and which every time she went to, I don't know, a shop or a market or the such, and saw something that would be nice, either in our house when we went back, or as a gift for her brothers and sisters and family and the such when we go back. So she would buy and store in this huge chest, which was, sitting in a corner. I still remember it quite vividly. So that the element of going back to Iraq was always there. It was always there. And there was no reason for it not to be. I mean, my father, till now, he's forever the optimist. And he was always saying, the Baathists are going to go. They're going to go. It can't carry on. The injustices are just too much. It's unsustainable. There are too many good people to accept that this is going to be the reality of Iraq. So that was always the running theme, that we're going to go back. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, and inshallah, it's going to be soon. It's not going to be.
At what point did that change?
I think it changed when, rather than go back to Iraq, my father had to begrudgingly accept a job offer in the Gulf. And he felt his dream was that he was going to head straight back from exile back home. But the fact that we had grown up, he was now worried that he wanted us to learn Arabic, he wanted us to know about Islam as a culture, as a society. And at the same time, he also wanted somewhere that he felt at least was closer. So I think, personally, that my father accepted that job, yes, for us, but also because he felt maybe it's not going to be a direct trip back home. Maybe I need to take a detour, and this is going to be a close enough detour. But I think deep inside he felt that this was going to take longer than he had anticipated.
Did he eventually go back?
No, he only went back after the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. And he went back as a leading figure of the Iraqi opposition, the Iraqi Islamic Party. And he went back and served in the Iraqi parliament for a number of years. And then he just got totally fed up and tired and sick of, literally sick of the corruption, of the lies, of the deception, of the failures. And he just gave up. He left, he resigned, despite many telling him, listen, go back to London, live with your family and just, collect the salary. You don't, why resign your post? But it just didn't sit well with him. So he just resigned his post, left everything and unfortunately came back home, which was London by then.
Presumably seeing your father's journey, this affected your own sense of obligation towards various different causes. This might not be the case, but presumably seeing how your father eventually got fed up or felt like this is going to take a much longer and a much bigger force to be able to reconstruct and rebuild and be able to establish his vision of justice in Iraq, you decided to remain in England and to work on your cause over here, which I assume was related to your Islamic identity.
Yes, I mean, that's a very neat way of telling a reality which is, culturally, this is my home. I mean, I tried to go to Iraq, visit Iraq, see whether I could, eventually go back. I tried going to various Arab Muslim countries, Turkey, Jordan, and I just couldn't. The fact is, and this is the price we all pay. And, it's not that terrible a price, but the fact that I grew up here, that I tell people that my English far outweighs my Arabic, and my Arabic's quite good, but I'm more comfortable speaking English. I tell people I dream in English. My dreams are in English. And the fact is that when I leave Britain for a while, I feel homesick to Britain, and it's ironic in a way. Taking the whole arc of our family experience and why my father left and brought us and his dream of us. That my father he bought a house in Baghdad, and from afar, over the phone. That was how things used to be done back then. And he refurbished the house twice, yet he never spent a single night in that house. Not a single night. And then he sold it, when he thought that he was never going to ever live there. It sort of pinches my heart a little bit when I remember when I went back to Iraq in 2005. And my father was showing me around the house that we all heard about so many times. Talks about, what kind of color should the walls be colored, and what kind of garden do we want to in front, and what kind of gate and the such. We all heard these conversations for years over the phone. So he took me to this house, a very nice house in a very nice area of Baghdad. And he was showing me around, and he was very enthusiastic about it. And he said, "You look like you're not entirely happy. Is there something?" And I said, "Baba, this is huge. This is way. It's huge. I mean, I don't know how many rooms there were." And he said, "Well, yes, this will be your room. This will be your sister's room. This will be." I thought to myself, my poor father. His dream was that ultimately we're all going to come back home. Yeah. I had married by then. I had kids by then. My sister had married by then. My three sisters had married by then. And I was thinking whether I should tell him, no one's going to come back. But it just shows it's a story. It's not a tragic story by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a story that reflects the deep and ingrained pains of someone who has to leave home and then the return back, which might never ever happen.
Yeah, I think for those of us who are the children of exiles, regardless of generation, our parents always have this poignant story and hopes. I mean, my parents, I think, always knew that Syria was probably not going to be a possibility. Even before the revolution started, my father, I mean, when Egypt started and then, when Tunis started and when Egypt started and when Yemen started, and I remember my father being on edge. Half of him didn't believe that Syria was going to start. The other half was he was following, and he had people inside and he was following constantly. And then when the revolution did start, that was the first time we heard him say, we might be able to go back. And I think for me, the very concept of going back was interesting because I've never been there in the first place. So what am I going back to? But yet my parents brought us up in a very nostalgic home where Syria was very much ingrained in our everyday, like day-to-day lives. And because my father worked on a cause which was so close to him, which was human rights, because my father himself, having been a prisoner, having been tortured, my father still has the signs of torture on his face and his back. And so we felt that kind of like, the sense of duty and the sense of obligation. At the same time, we felt like we were part of something bigger that we haven't experienced, but maybe will experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Anas, we've spoken now about your early life and about your affinity via your father to the homeland that is Iraq. And now you are the CEO and founder of Cordova Foundation. We're speaking about a block of maybe 4 decades.
Yeah.
How did we get here? Can you speak me through that?
I started having quite a deep sense of lack of justice. I think I was around 16 or 17.
Okay.
Various things that happened either at college, on the news. This was towards the latter part of the 80s, the Thatcher years. And I started becoming more involved in my local student union. And more importantly, I would suggest, is when I came across someone whom after Friday prayers stood up and talked about the importance of Muslims, British Muslims, voting. And I recall that person came in for a lot of abuse, and people started shouting him down and saying, this is unacceptable Islamically. And it sort of had me go back and think. And I started discussing this, and that led me to a path whereby I absolutely believed that it was untenable for British Muslims at the time, around the 1.2 million, 1.4, to be inactive politically, and yet, everything around them was driven either by issues of faith or identity or culture or even politics with the Muslim world. And then obviously we had the Iraqi invasion we were in the depth of the Iraqi-Iran war, then that stopped. And then we were in the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and the horrific attack against Iraq, which for the very first time the world watched live on CNN. And that was in itself, I think, quite a landmark. It was, because it all of a sudden changed everything, because we used to receive the news a few hours later at best, sometimes a few days later. But now you can actually see the missile as it's launched, and you can see it as it falls. And that was something that I think shocked many an audience around the world. And I was definitely impacted by that. And then obviously the embargo and the sanctions against Iraq, which reduced Iraqi society, generally a middle-class, affluent, well-educated society, into a generation of people who knew nothing but to line up for a couple of oranges, or to, where children wouldn't know what a banana was, for instance, because they had never seen a banana in their lives. I remember till now a primary teacher who was executed because in teaching her students, 5-year-olds, about the alphabet, she used the example of Mose, meme, Mose, banana. And she was reported to the authorities, and the authorities took her and apparently executed her because she had broken, national interest. And it was horrific. It was a time. So I got involved in charity work, but all of this, it led to my education politically. My awareness of the fact that justice was an issue. Justice was a problem.
Justice internationally, or justice when it comes to Iraq?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Everywhere. I mean, Iraq was, at the time, it was the sort of manifestation of a much bigger problem. Remember, I mean, these thoughts came to me during the Thatcher years, when at the time, I went to school at the time when I used to be met with a carton of milk and a piece of fruit every single day. And then I saw how that was eroded and taken away from school children during times of depression. And so all of this led me to sort of try to think about the issue of justice, not only in pertaining to Iraq, but also globally, how that is impacting. And then came obviously the events of 9/11. Okay. And I think that 9/11 was a defining moment for probably most nations around the world, because it wasn't just about a terrorist attack. It was about where you stood. You know, the iconic, incredibly tragic and brutal words of George W. Bush back then ring true till now. And they went far in defining where people stood. You are either with us or you are with the terrorists, leaving no middle ground. At that time, as a student, as someone whom I was pursuing a career in academia, the most important part of the whole puzzle was the middle ground, was the gray area. Nothing was black and white. Very little were black and white. It was all about the discussion, the debate, the negotiation. It was all about that. And all of a sudden, with one fell swoop, the most powerful politically man in the world declared that there was no middle ground anymore. You were either on the side of those who wanted to seek revenge come what may, or you were on the side of the assailants of terror and violence and bloodshed and the such. And that just, I think it threw me at the depth of political activism. And probably for the first time, I would suggest, before that, I would be part of campaigns for Muslims to vote and for various issues. But I think the very first time where I saw myself, standing on a soapbox and shouting, from the rafters and calling people to actually do something. It was the very first time after that, and hence came the AntiWar Movement.
Okay.
And obviously that was quite an iconic time, not only personally, but I think in the lifetime of our country, in our community, because we saw how people who weren't affiliated either religiously or ethnically or the such, come to see something is wrong, carried out by their own government, and to stand up and declare it as being wrong. And I think that's quite an important moment in the life of Britain, and as well as, virtually every other country in the world.
And activism against states.
Yeah.
Particularly with the anti-war movement.
Absolutely. Standing against the government.
Yeah.
And against whom? Against a Labour Prime Minister at the time, a Labour government at the time, a government which essentially the values of Labour as we think it is anti-war, is pro-immigration, is, pro-tolerance and all of these things. All of a sudden, adopt a stand which I was, I think, among many who thought at the time that this is horrific. It's not just a war that will bring down a regime. It'll have its
major ramifications.
Its implications and ramifications that we will feel for much longer.
Did you feel like, and again, just back to you and your relationship with the various different causes and your identities, was this a moment which reconciled your various different identities, both being an Iraqi, but also being a Brit, and also being a Muslim? Since you said that you've had various different, I don't want to say various different lives, but you've lived within various different contexts, your father's, but then also prior to this moment, you were working on ensuring that Muslims were active citizens in Britain. Was this a moment which reconciled all of that?
I believe so, yes. It sort of made sense, if you wish. It made sense because at the time there was a political development within British society, and that is the coalition that was built between the Muslim community as well as the left and CND at the time. So that coalition was very, very interesting, and whether it would hold or not, or whether it would work or not. You're talking about people on total opposite
spectrums.
Absolutely, on the spectrum. Ideologically, culturally, totally different, but still coming together for this particular cause. That was an important moment of time, I believe. But also that this was, firstly, an issue of war that was flagrantly, clearly wrong. There was absolutely no call for it. And secondly, Iraq. So all of a sudden, it absolutely made sense. It came easy to me. It's something that I had been connected to not only through my father, through my childhood memories, but also for the past 12, 13 years before that, the sanctions and trying to break the blockade and call for assistance to the Iraqi people. And it made sense also because I think, my faith, the tenets of my faith, the values that I was brought up as a young Muslim, it just made absolute sense that this is something that I needed to work for. And obviously we had many rallies and marches. In the life of Britain, it's not really that known for the Brits to march in freezing cold weather and rain and the such, but we saw some magnificent scenes of people coming together, grannies traveling from far and wide, converging on London and doing their own banners and knitting their own sweatshirts.
I was there, my father took me, I think I was, how old was I, 7, maybe? I remember walking down the streets of London.
It was incredible. I mean, people of all ages, of all tendencies, of all backgrounds, and all banners and the such, all coming together. And I the fact that I was one of the chairs of the 2 Million March, that in itself was, one of the highlights of my own career. And it's, I'm incredibly proud of that. But coming to your question about the Cordova Foundation, the Cordova Foundation came, I would suggest, at a particular moment of time during one of those rallies, which hundreds of thousands were part of. And I recall thinking to myself, if 2 million people march and bring London to a standstill, and hundreds of thousands, if not even more, keep on coming to London to protest government policy to bring war and bring us to war. If that didn't work, what would work? So I think it was that kind of question that I started asking myself, that would it be better to do like we're doing right now, being outside in Parliament Square, in Whitehall and the such, and, screaming the house down about humanity and about justice and about freedom and about liberation, all of this? Or would it be more effective if we were inside the House of Parliament, if we were inside the corridors, if we had someone's ear and we were advising them as to what they should do? Especially that, the most remarkable thing is after the 2 Million March, I would attend talks and lectures and whenever I came across someone who voted for the war, an MP, for instance, they would always say, "Oh, I was there in the march. I was part of the 2 million. I brought my mother down. I brought me and my wife and our kids, and we were there." And it dawned on me that even those who voted for the war, I mean, it's not a matter of people being good or bad. It's not that. Sometimes it's whether people have the correct kind of information to act properly upon. And then I thought that maybe we need to have something that talks to people, convey information in a totally different channel, through a different discourse and narrative, and speak to their senses, intellectual as well as emotional, and tell them, what's right and what's wrong. Maybe I didn't have a word for it back then, but it was essentially what we know today as being lobbying, but not lobbying in the sort of very dirty, I have to say.
Or advocacy.
It's advocacy, but more than that. It's about being close to people, getting to know them even on a personal level, and speaking to their sense, to their humanity about various issues. Obviously, Iraq was a big thing. The war on terror was a very big thing. Palestine was another very big thing. And then obviously, I didn't know that 5-6 years later, we'd be talking about a totally momentous moment in the life and times of the Arab world, and that is the Arab Spring, and we'd be talking about a totally different kind of. So all of this brought me to the Cordova Foundation. I thought that we needed something that made people understand. And it shocked me, by the way, not only, there's this belief that the West doesn't understand Arabs or Muslims. It doesn't understand, and therefore it acts from a departure point of ignorance. But then you find the very same level of ignorance in the Arab and Muslim world towards what is the West. How do we speak to the West? Who do we speak to the West? So that kind of mutual understanding that needed to happen between both the West as a construct, ideological, cultural, political, and the Muslim world, again, ideological, cultural, less political because of the
you do mention this, and I think it's your slogan at Cordova Foundation, bridging the gap of understanding between the Muslim world and the West. And I think this is very interesting to me, because how are we defining the Muslim world? And are we talking about British Muslims and Muslims in the West as part of this Muslim world? And how are we defining the West? And ultimately, how are we claiming, or rather, is the Cordova Foundation claiming that they are two completely separate concepts that can't necessarily reconcile? As an active Muslim, I want to understand what makes a Muslim world Muslim. What is a Muslim world? Are we speaking just about cultural borders? Are we speaking about cultural boundaries? What is Muslim?
It's a fascinating question and a fascinating discussion that ought to be had. I recall once being at, I think it was York University, I can't remember exactly, but and having this debate. And I was using we must be more just. We, and my opposites came up and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Altikriti, when you say we, who do you mean?
Yeah.
Who are you talking about? Are you talking about? And that hit me for a moment. It actually shook me, because all of a sudden I needed to understand to myself when I was saying we, I was talking as a Brit. And being a Muslim was just by the by. I was Brit. I was talking about, I was part of this construct that attacked the people in Iraq. That was my departure point. But the fact that I was called to clarify this, to actually define, hang on, when you say we, who do you mean? Who are you talking about? And it was as though there was some scorn also put out that, do you really think that you speak for Britain or for the British people? It's something that really needs to be addressed. Are British Muslims part of the Muslim construct worldwide, the Ummah, if you wish? Or are they Brits that happen to be Muslims? And therefore they have a duty towards, through the values of their faith, but towards their homeland. That we ensure that Britain acts responsibly, morally, ethically. It's a very big question. And to be honest, I believe that the further we delve into identity politics, the more problems we have.
Okay.
It's something that I think we need to be aware of. Okay. Unfortunately, today we have this polarized positions regarding those who wish everything to be identified, everything having a label. And it goes beyond just politics to culture, to ethnicity, to sexual orientation, to identity, whether you identify as a male or female or the such. I mean, it's gone to the very depths of, I would suggest, absurdity. Now everything has to be labeled, everything has to be icon, everything has to be put in a particular box. I think it creates far bigger problems than we need to.
Yeah.
Than we need to, and and you have to remember that those years were identified by the prominence of the argument of the clash of civilization. That the clash of civilization was inevitable. You know, Samuel Huntington wrote about the clash of civilizations 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
And whilst it was there, but no one really paid attention to it. But after 9/11, all of a sudden, everyone started speaking about the clash of civilizations. So there was a need for something to dampen and to counter that argument that clash of civilizations, when Islam is present, you have to add, is inevitable. And we argued it's neither inevitable nor is it necessary, nor is it of any benefit whatsoever. That's a foregone conclusion.
But you still defined two different civilizations by saying the Muslim world and the West.
Two different constructs rather than civilizations. I would never assume to call the Muslim Ummah right now a civilization. I mean, there is nothing that the premise of a civilization is quite well identified, and there is none of it. Unfortunately, today when you talk about Muslims, you're talking about people, you're talking about nations. I mean, you're talking about, when I say the Muslim world, what do I mean by that? I mean countries that are geographically proximate and where there's a majority of Muslims. I'm guessing that is it, because you don't have Muslim nations actually self-determining their own futures, their own presence or their futures. You have a geographical area. So, I mean, you have people that are ruled by oppressive regimes. This area is extremely rich. It has wealth in terms of minerals, in terms of raw material, in terms of energy, as well as in terms of young nations, young men and women who have the potential to create a future, something that, for instance, Europe doesn't have.
Mm-hmm. Why does Europe not have this?
Well, Europe is aging. I mean, I think that the growth rate is declining, and you're talking about societies where the average age is well in the 40s.
Okay.
And that economically as well as strategically is incredibly dangerous. And that's why I would presume countries like Germany and some Scandinavian countries change their rules and laws of immigration in order to attract younger recruits for business, for society, for work and the such, because ultimately the way European societies are going, within a matter of 30, 40 years, we're going to have far more retired citizens than we have people working and paying taxes to pay for their pensions. It's a nightmare scenario. So you have this area, but with that, you have the prevalence of oppression, of dictatorships, of rogue regimes, of conflict, of violence. So an entire construct, as important as it is from every single side, but it's one that is stunted by its own realities. And that's something that unfortunately isn't understood. When you read in the Times or the Daily Telegraph about a Muslim country, there is this assumption you feel that when you're talking about a country, you're talking about the government and people as though they are one.
Yes.
But that is seldom the case, as you and I, I'm pretty sure, know and acknowledge.
Okay, so we've defined the Muslim world, and I think this makes sense. The West. How do you define the West? As mentioned in the Cordova Foundation statement, because I find this very interesting, bridging the gap of understanding between the Muslim world and the West. We've just understood that the Muslim world isn't a civilizational point, it's a construct. Muslim people live, for the most part, the majority of the population, if defined by faith, are defined as Muslims. But then we're not necessarily speaking about Islamic civilization, or Islamic civilizations rather, since there are various Islamic civilizations. So we're looking at it from a very statist perspective, from a very political perspective. The West. Yeah. How are we defining that?
Well, the first thing to be said is that we're not talking about the geographical West. We're talking about, even Australia or New Zealand, which are at the very extremes of the East that are part of this construct. We're talking about, again, a cultural a construct that probably Japan could belong to. Where some Western countries, Western geographically, wouldn't belong to. For instance, I mean, you'd find that for instance, I mean, even if you look to Latin America, for instance, albeit towards the West, but many countries do not define as being proximate ideologically, culturally to Europe or to even North America and to the American
So is it accurate
cabinet.
To say that the West is more of a secular concept over here?
No, not necessarily secular, because I do believe that faith is a prominent and predominant, actually, driving factor, regardless of how many academic studies show otherwise. I still think that in everyday life, religion plays a role. I'm talking about power. I think I'm talking about power. I'm talking about dominance, and dominance not necessarily all in a good way. The control of resources, the control of movement, the control of the lives of nations, the fact that there is a well-developed system that is represented by the West, where you have the overpowering organizations and associations that are essentially, they should belong to everyone, but they are part of the Western, again, construct. And that it's all about power and dominance. And I mean, for instance, I recall this when in recent months we had the return of the Taliban to govern in Afghanistan. I remember within a matter of hours, and there was still the scenes of chaos at Kabul airport that we all saw, and all of a sudden we had this statement from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, saying that. We are holding on to something like $9 billion of Afghani money. We're holding on to that until things become clear. And I had a lecture that very same night, and I told people, listen, the statement that came out today, do you understand what this means? That this IMF that should be theoretically at the service of people, at the service of, is saying because we don't like the way things have transpired in Afghanistan, we're going to hold on to the money that we acknowledge is yours, that we're going to hold on to. We're not going to give it to you, until we're satisfied that things meet our standards. And that is something that I think epitomizes, when we talk about West and the rest of the world, whether it be the Muslim world, whether it be, whatever is not West. I think that is specifically what we're talking about. We're talking about, the ability to dominate, the ability to actually do things according to a set of standards that the rest of the world never took part in constructing. It's a game where the rules were made in the absence of everyone else. Okay. But everyone needs to abide by. To abide by. Yeah.
So, Dr. Anas, we've spoken about the constructs and the concepts of the Muslim world in the West. We've spoken about your various experiences in organizing the marches in the anti-war movement. Now let's speak about the role of Cordova Foundation. Where does Cordova Foundation come in all of this? What do you do?
The Cordova Foundation was essentially introduced to, let's say, the British academic scene as a platform where people can network, people can exchange ideas, where we have a chance to meet with people of varying, opposing ideas even, and have a discussion, have a dialogue, have a debate. The objective was that. The objective was meeting people from all sides of the argument, of whatever argument that may have been. And at the same time, trying to summarize those exchanging thoughts into something of benefit to decision makers. Okay. And therefore, the Cordova Foundation was never meant to be a grassroots sort of membership-based organization. It was always meant to be a platform of ideas whereby we can introduce a new set of policies, of decisions, of actions that would bear, hopefully, better results and that would bring together the variety of ideas and perspectives around the table. That was the initial objective. But with time and with changing circumstances of various natures, whether it be political, whether it be cultural, ideological, security, all of this, it led to Cordoba being more of an advocacy platform than anything else. And particularly when the Arab Spring emerged, the Cordova Foundation played quite, I would suggest, an important role in informing, particularly Western academic centers, as well as political centers, whether it be parliaments, whether it be politicians across Europe and North America, on how best to deal with this emerging major development. For a while, we were meeting with the American administration, we were meeting with European governments, and it was quite an interesting time because the Arab Spring lit something that was never, most people didn't think existed. The fact that these people for decades were described even by their own governments as being almost dead, beyond life. But clearly, a new emerging generation that wanted something totally different. Okay. And that, I think, inspired many. And we saw what's happened in the West with the Occupy movement, with various other street-based movements, which thought of Maidan al-Tahrir, for instance, in Egypt as being an icon, and they called, Times Square, for instance, part of it as Tahrir.
But we've also had the opposite impact, of course, with Syria. I mean, you spoke previously about working with the anti-war movement, but unfortunately, right now, the anti-war movement, their stances on Syria are not just disappointing; I'd say they're damning. In their support for a dictator.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the many. Outcomes which I think should have been expected, because, like I said, when the Muslim community and the left came together amid the anti-war, then created the anti-war movement, the modern anti-war movement, these ideological differences were sort of put aside because there was this one goal, and that is standing against the war in Iraq and against American imperialism and the show of power, and whoever, might is right, and whoever bore the gun must be on the side of correct. And that was a very important point to be made. But what we came to discover was that there were some irreconcilable differences amid the Arab Spring, because whilst the Muslim communities, I would suggest, throughout the West, absolutely applauded the attempt by the Arab people to free themselves from the shackles, decade-long, probably even century-long shackles of oppressive regimes backed by Western powers or Eastern powers, in the case of Syria and Yemen and Libya and such. Our old comrades were unfortunately on the side of the regimes, on the side of Gaddafi, on the side of Assad, on the side of, and this created quite a significant crack. And I think that the way in which we dealt with it was that I remember having a very difficult but necessary and quite robust meeting with leaders of the movements of trade unions and the such, in which we clarified that, this is, to us, this is something that we can't overlook. This is something that is too important. And it's not just important because we happen to be Muslims, but it's important because finally this part of the world, which has been deprived of any light of freedom, of democracy, of justice, has a chance to embrace all of that. So we're not going to negotiate on something that the people on the streets have themselves taken the initiative and decide. We are on the team of the nations, and that is something that needs to be made absolutely clear. So yes, I mean, that's part of being part of a coalition. That's creating coalitions with people or with elements or with parties where there are some deep differences.
How do you reconcile that, though? So you've had this meeting and you've sat down with these leaders who have very drastic views when it comes to, or violent rather views, when it comes to the very nations that you're supporting. And we're not just speaking about nations that, we're speaking about people who have died in their thousands and their tens of thousands. But then, of course, this isn't an attack at all. This is just trying to understand the process of how do you then reconcile the fact that you're still in a coalition with people who are obscuring the voices of other activists or other people who are trying very hard to carry that cause? You do your best in order to not lose the coalition on things that you agree on. I mean, for instance, that same coalition is a very important part, let's say, of the pro-Palestinian movement, of the global pro-Palestinian movement. And the left generally is a very important construct or part of that pro-Palestinian movement. You try not to damn that or to disseminate that. But at the same time, you have to be absolutely clear in that, the supporting regimes such as Bashar al-Assad, supporting regimes, hailing
the likes of Gaddafi, hailing the likes of the former Tunisian regime or the Egyptian regime is just it's just unacceptable.
But don't you think that, say, amplifying certain voices, even if for a completely different cause, but amplifying these causes and normalizing them to an extent, contributes to the normalizing of violence when it comes to the causes that they oppose? So, for instance, if we have, I don't want to name any names, but we have, say, figures who are not at all great when it comes to Libya, when it comes to Syria, who support, and not just support, they actively deny the genocide that is taking place in Syria, for instance, or they actively deny the Ghouta attack that took place, the chemical attack, which killed hundreds of Syrians. But then they're amplified in when it comes to the pro-Palestine cause by within these types of coalitions. Isn't that a type of normalizing which then ultimately harms people? Like how, this is me trying to understand how we can actually form coalitions, but without weighing causes against each other and without damning a people because another cause trumps it.
You have to fight for each and every cause. I would suggest that a simple way out is to focus on the causes and to say that we agree on this and that, but we totally disagree on something else. And I understand your point about validating other voices. And it's important that those voices on the issue of Syria, on Libya, on dictatorship in the Arab world are never validated. It's quite clear. I would suggest that over the years, since the Arab Spring, we have managed to an extent, probably limited, but to an extent, to bring to our side, if you wish, many elements within that particular movement. But I have to also concede that we've been defeated in terms of trying to make the left understand the enormity of standing against, the revolutions, the popular revolutions of 2011, 2012, and 2013, and onwards up until now. One of the biggest impediments, I have to say, and I was party to this. I was, really thrown into trying to make people see. I took people to meet, various people who had suffered immensely, whether it be in camps, whether it be in exile, whether it be... Unfortunately, and this is something that we need to think about quite clearly, unfortunately, the Western left generally, and I'd have to say that amongst, the European left, because America doesn't really have a sort of a leftist culture, but Europe more so, and particularly when you're talking about France, when you're talking... the British left is, in comparison to the French left, far rosier and far easier to deal with. But I have to say that one of the biggest impediments is the fact that the left in Europe essentially feeds from the left in the Arab world, and that is their first point of call. And the left in the Arab world, I would suggest, by far and wide, their stand has been absolutely disgraceful.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they are the feeding platforms to the left in the Western world. So whilst we have friends who will say, we take your point of view and we thank you for your efforts and we acknowledge all of that, but ultimately they will be listening. Yeah. Their ears will be lent to some other party, and it is a problem, and it is an ongoing discussion, and quite. I have to say, it's quite the dilemma. It is quite the dilemma. It
is. I think particularly with the platforming. I work in the Syria context. I've been working for the past 10 years. Since I was 18, since the revolution started. But of course, being my father's daughter, I've been privy to this since I was born, essentially. Yeah. My father being a leading figure when it comes to human rights violations and opposition in Syria. But I think as I've grown, as I've branched out, I live in Istanbul now. I work with various different organizations. And one of the major obstacles, even when you're working with just a medical organization, which isn't politically active, but the major obstacles are always the narratives which are pushed by the anti-imperialists and by the left on us. So, for instance, I'm an advocacy officer at a medical organization right now, but the things that I work on, are trying to correct narratives to just prove, for instance, that hospitals inside Syria treat people for normal, non-trauma things, that not everything is... so basically trying to prove that hospitals don't treat combatants, not necessarily, that people in war zones get sore throats, that people in war zones get flus and viruses, and that's why they go to the hospitals. And we have to take all this data, we have to analyze it, we have to manage it just to push this through, because what's being pushed at us from the left is that hospitals are spaces for Al-Qaeda, or spaces for insurgents, or spaces for people who are terrorists, as the state defines them as terrorists, which is funny because this is very much the language of the war on terror, which they've co-opted.
Yes.
And even when you're working in seemingly non-political spaces, you have to constantly fight against this narrative, as opposed to kind of like put your efforts elsewhere in lobbying donors and governments in order to help you with the funds. And then on the other hand, you have your own communities, which understandable that we live in a very complex world. But then you go back home and you find your own communities platforming people who contribute to these very harmful narratives. And it's a very difficult space to be in. I mean, personally, I don't know how my father did it. And I think at one point when my father was much more active, this wasn't as bad because Syria, the revolution hadn't started yet. But now with the revolution starting, we have 7 million refugees. We have half of the population have become internally displaced. We have at least 600,000 killed and murdered. We're trying to fight to define this as a genocide, and it's very difficult reconciling that then with your own community. And
at the same time, what's happening right now is the I would suggest disgraceful reinitiation of the Assad regime within the international community.
By Jordan, by the UAE.
I mean, those are the ones who are overtly doing it. But unfortunately, we know for a fact that our government here in the UK and America and throughout Europe, all the steps that we recommended to these governments to blockade the businesses, to close down the assets and accounts of the elements of the regime, whether it be Asma al-Assad or whether it be the cousins or the such who run the economy. All of those fell on deaf ears. And now it's been sort of announced that Bashar al-Assad will be reintroduced to the international fold. He'll be re-invited to all the international conferences and the such. There's a huge problem, and the problem is that when it comes to politics, we have an absolute aversion to any sense of morality or efficacy, and I believe that if there is anything, the reason why we continue to talk about young people turning away from politics, being totally apathetic, I think this is the main reason why. And it's showing around the world. It's showing that unfortunately today one of the titles that come with a lot of negativity is politics and politicians. So it's a huge problem. The scenario that you raise is incredibly important and very, very interesting, and that is, I think, a question that could be asked or molded in Muslims who live as a minority, Western or Eastern or wherever they are, or Muslims generally. Let's talk about Indonesia, for instance. How possible is it for them to build alliances and coalitions and create friendships on a sort of a blanket agreement on all the main issues? How difficult or easy or even possible is that? And if that is not possible, and I would suggest that it's virtually impossible, how do you manage that? Managing alliances, managing those friendships, managing those relationships. How do you do that? Because the thing that you'll agree with someone is this, you will definitely come to disagree with them on another point. So the question here, and particularly for Muslims living as minorities in this case in Great Britain, how do they come to manage those relations and alliances? What are the criteria that govern with whom they declare an alliance or a partnership? And what are the criteria that make that partnership null and void? I think that's an incredibly important question.
What's the criteria that you found?
Like I said, I think the easiest, and this is the easiest way out, is to go case on case. It's not perfect by any sense of the word, but it's the easier way out to go case on case and to say, listen, I agree with you on 20%, on 50%, we're going to collaborate on those, but then we disagree on 50%, 70% or whatever, and when we're going to totally disagree on that. It's the easy way out, but there needs to be a strategic.
And there need to be measures, I think. So, for instance, I think what we've seen is, like we said, we've had people who work with the left and with anti-imperialists on Palestine, which is commendable, and they do have strength. And they do reach to a different audience than Muslims and the Muslim communities. But then, say if we were to take the Syria cause, it wouldn't be acceptable of us to work with people who are pro-Israelis. And see, this is the line that I don't understand. Where do we draw the line?
Can I give you another example? Actually, something that I was in discussion with a local councillor here in London just a few days ago. There is someone putting forward a white paper regarding the banning of slaughter. Okay.
Slaughter of animals.
Slaughter of animals, yes, as in halal. Out of consideration, as they put it, out of consideration for animal welfare and all of these things. The Muslims who know about this are, of course, quite concerned because this, by the way, passed in France just last year. It passed in France. So now abattoirs and places of slaughter and the such cannot operate according to Islamic laws. Okay? The question is, does the Muslim community collaborate, for instance, with the Jewish pro-Israel Zionist community because they are also up in arms regarding the same thing? Do we or do we not? The same goes, for instance, for circumcision of boys, of Muslim boys. Again, the proposals to ban that faced a tirade of anger, not only from Muslims, but also from that element of Jews. Do we or do we not? Do we say, listen, we can't negotiate in terms of Palestine and such because, the difference is so great. But can we come together on this? And should we come together on this? It's an argument that needs to be had. It's a discussion, I think, that will bear many interesting perspectives, I would say, to the very least.
Okay, so Dr. Anas, now we've spoken about Cordova Foundation, we've spoken about local coalitions, which ultimately spill into more international issues and how we can try and circumvent them or work around them. For the final part of our discussion, I want to speak about the hostage negotiations, which you deal with. I believe you started in 2005 up until 2019. What's the story?
Well, the first thing to be said is that I have no formal training or experience in negotiation by that time. In 2005, what happened was there was a group of 4 Christian peacemakers who traveled to Iraq for various reasons. One of them was a Brit called Norman Kember, a retired radiologist. And his objective from going to Iraq was to build a hospital for children, for Iraqi children. The 4 of them were very much part of the AntiWar Movement. And Norman Kember had marched, amongst the throngs of Brits across the years and felt quite strongly against the occupation of Iraq. So anyway, they traveled to Iraq. And on the very second day of their arrival, were abducted. But at that time, this was it was the height of the abduction business. I mean, there were many, many groups, some of them quite big and renowned, some of them Al-Qaeda, for instance. Others were much less renowned and very obscure, some for financial reasons, some for media and exposure, some for politics and political demands and the like. And many of those incidents ended in tragedy by the kidnapped person being killed. As happened, for instance, with Margaret Hassan, who was famously killed at the time. So being in the leadership of the Muslim Association in Britain, and as well as the anti-war movement, I was asked whether I would be happy traveling to Iraq and basically making appeals through Iraqi media to those who might have kidnapped Norman Kember and his three fellow Christian peacemakers. And that was it. And that was my very first visit to Iraq.
Okay. Oh, okay.
That was the very first
This
time.
was your father's dream of you returning to
Yeah.
Iraq?
This was how I managed to go back.
Okay.
So I went, and because my father had settled in Iraq a couple of years earlier, so I had a house, to go to. And so I went and did the media rounds. There was a huge media interest, and I was basically making these interviews and telling, hopefully, to whoever knew anything about the kidnappers or was part of the group that kidnapped, just basically saying, listen, these people are friends of the Iraqi peoples. Then the Iraqi people, they're not part of the American or British alliance to occupy and the such, and therefore they're friends. And if you want the betterment of Iraq, then letting them go would be the best thing. And
just to clarify, you went by yourself?
I went by myself.
To Iraq?
Abadan. And yes, and just to basically make these media appeals. Nothing more.
And you were sent?
And
you were sent by
I was delegated by the anti-war movement.
Okay.
Yes, I mean it made sense, and me, being an Iraqi and going back, and so I did that for about 5-6 days, and I was due to leave. I had done the job that I went there to. And then I started receiving phone calls from people saying, "Oh, we know something about this, and we can help you, and we'd like to meet." And so I'd meet with people in hope that they would. I asked the question, "Should I meet with these people?" And at the time, the advice was, "Yes, why not?" And this basically morphed into actually going to areas and to meet with people who claimed that either they had Norman Kember, but then it turns out that they wanted money, or people who wanted, they were just trying to mess things up, I guess. They had no interest whatsoever, had no information, but they wanted to show themselves as though they knew what was happening. And this carried on until we, somehow we got a thread. Someone, apparently knew something. And I followed up with this thread, and it ended up being a negotiation over the phone, and many, many calls. Some went on for close to 50 minutes, an hour, in one or two occasions, trying to reach some sort of deal. I have to say that the group I never met directly, but I met someone who claimed that they knew them, and clearly I got a phone call afterwards, and that phone call was what led to their ultimate release, but many months later. And I always say this: they never asked for money, they never asked for a ransom. They had a demand which was
the kidnappers never asked for a ransom.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think they repeated the same request, the same demand from day one, and that is the release of female prisoners in Iraqi or American-run prisons. And I said, listen, your message has been conveyed loud and clear, but I can't guarantee. It's not in my power. I don't think it's in anyone's power to actually pass such judgment. So by, I think, the fourth month, by March of 2006, this was in November of 2005. So by March 2006, I think that they had reached the end of their line, basically, because looking after four quite prominent hostages, one American, two Canadian, where the world media was talking about them, keeping them obscure, keeping them hidden, but at the same time feeding them, looking after them, treating them if they're ill, was something that was not easy. So I think that at the end they sort of gave up.
Without the demands being met?
As far as we know, without the demands being met. So that, I thought that was the end of that. I mean, it was a good outcome. So I thought that was the end of that. But then I started getting calls from other people who had heard about what's happened. And they either knew or they had loved ones who were kidnapped, and they wanted me to get involved. And at first, because I didn't know how to do these things, and I realized how sensitive they were. I mean, it's mentally quite draining, psychologically quite draining, because every time you go and do an interview on the BBC or CNN or the such, you think to yourself, have I said the right thing? Have I said something that might lead to someone being harmed or hurt or even killed? So it's quite difficult, from the mental and emotional point of view. But out of my wish to help and to assist, so I got involved again, and that's had a positive outcome. And then again, and then again. And the last hostage that I assisted in getting released was in late 2018. And that was the 21st hostage. There are still ongoing cases which have been going on for years in Libya, in Somalia.
Oh, so this was international. It wasn't just in Iraq.
No. It was Syria, Yemen. It was essentially conflict zones.
Okay. And it was primarily between Western-based residents, like people who were resided in the West?
Many of them are locals. I mean, for instance, there is an ongoing case, quite tragic, a 5-year case now, of a Somali girl kidnapped by some gangs in Libya. And we've been trying now for years to see that she is released. I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's going nowhere. But no. I mean, they're not Westerners all the time. They were Westerners on this occasion, the first occasion, and then 2 more occasions beyond that. But beyond that, it was all locals. Sometimes locals trapped in different countries. I mean, like I said, this Somali girl in Libya. There was some Iraqis in Syria. There was some Syrians in Iraq, and so on. So sometimes that happens. And thankfully, till now, I don't knowingly, I'm not aware of anyone who has been killed, whom I've been involved in negotiating their release. But like I said, there are now 2 or 3 ongoing cases, and we don't know what the outcome is. But listen, ultimately, it's been a very fulfilling experience from a personal point of view. Knowing that someone is safe and well, someone is back with their families. I recall a particular gentleman who was caught in Syria, and who I had to physically do something, go somewhere, and to negotiate very, quite robustly with. You get to meet some really horrible people, I have to say. I mean, this is the downside of this business. Yeah. And sometimes you have to bite your tongue. And you have to, when someone is telling you about the virtue of killing and spreading blood, and you're thinking to yourself, do I say something here, or do I, because I'm here to save someone's life? So you have to sometimes bite your tongue, and that could be extremely difficult. And you could be in the presence of people whom have blood on their hands. But you're there for a purpose. You're there for a reason. And that teaches you a lot of... I have to say, it's impacted me in my own dealings in normal life. I don't get as angry and frustrated as I used to as a young man. I realized that... there are some really horrible people, regardless of what religion they claim to hold on to, or an identity, or even a cause. Yeah. But sometimes there are some really, really horrible kinds out there. But yeah, I mean, it's been an experience, and I think that by now, I know what to do when I'm told about a particular case. I know how to navigate my way. I know how to have an exchange of some sorts, and it's not something that I wish to be part of, but I'm part of.
It's not something you ever imagined you'd actually.
No, and to be honest, I don't thrive on it. It's not something that I am looking in order to be involved in. But it's part of my life.
Okay, so Dr. Anas, we've spoken extensively about your life, and still there are many things we haven't touched on. We haven't spoken about your involvement in MAB. We haven't spoken about many things. We have spoken briefly about Cordova Foundation, about the hostage negotiations, about the partnerships and the lobbying and the activism in general, and of course about your the way in which your father shaped your life and your upbringing. All of this, of course, you a man of a certain caliber, which we're very privileged to know. I think the last thing I want to ask is if we go back to the priorities of Muslims in the West. Clearly it seems from our conversation that you were driven by faith, and that appears to be your primary identity. If you were, I could be completely wrong, but I think from our conversation it appears that faith, being a Muslim, is very much prominent.
Yes.
It's much more prominent than you being British or being
correct,
being Iraqi. And everything you've done has been to aid various different causes, but within this context of you being a Muslim in the West. So what do you think, or do you have any perceptions of the priorities of, and of course we can't, Muslims are not a homogenous group. Yeah. We cannot say that Muslims have to do X, Y, and Z. But if you were to take a certain group, a certain demographic, at least those within your local community, what are the priorities you believe they should be focused on as Muslims in the West?
I think that we face a challenge. And yes, you're absolutely right. My Muslim identity is I think dominates all the other labels that I carry, I also have a strong sense of belonging to this country and to these people, and like I said, it's my country. It's where if I was to leave, I get homesick. I always come back to the UK. But we are facing a huge crisis. We are facing a calamity. I would actually go out on a limb and say that the world is in a very perilous place. Only the past few weeks we've been talking about COP26 and about the climate change and about the impact that we human beings have had on our home, and how it is almost irreversible. The kind of damage that we have created. So we're leaving our children and our grandchildren. We're leaving them a terrible, terrible legacy of what we've done to the world. But I think it goes beyond that. I think that we have a crisis that is of political making. We have a crisis that is of economic making. We have a crisis on the level of justice. We have an immense crisis on the level of morality. Morality has now become a dirty word. I mentioned the word morality in a seminar just a few months ago, and I was shouted down. And people associate that distinctly with religion, as though I was promoting my Islam. I said, morality has nothing to do with religion. Religion might feed a sense of morality, might contribute towards, but I'm talking about the sense of right and wrong that is available to every single human being, regardless of their faith, regardless of their identity, regardless of their culture. That sense of right and wrong, that sense of what is useful and what is not useful, that sense of not exploiting someone's needs, someone's weaknesses, someone's vulnerability, for instance. We're losing that. And unfortunately, that is becoming what is right. That there are elements that are, when I recall when in the 80s we had the film Wall Street. You might not have been born when that came. So when Wall Street came out, I remember till now. The main character was Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas, and the famous statement that he made was, "Greed is good." Greed is good. And I recall when that came out, it was a takedown of capitalism, of greed. But for some reason, we are now in a place where once again, greed seems to be good. And that's being adopted not only by corporations and the private sector, where you'd expect that mantra to be strong, but even by states and governments.
But this isn't new necessarily. I mean, if we look at the development of politics, I could be wrong, but I think from my studies, it appears that from Machiavelli's statement when he said that one must have the capacity to not be good, it started from then. We're talking about at least 200 years prior.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But the thing is that we have reached a breaking point. When we have a situation where less than 1% of the world population own more than 75% of the world population, when we have the disparity in the gap growing to unprecedented levels, when we have people relying on a £20 voucher in order so that they don't have to choose between either staying warm or eating, when we have millions of children who don't know any better, who haven't been part of making this reality, but have to suffer the fact that they need to go for hours without having food or protein, it becomes ridiculous. We're not talking, when we talk about poverty in the UK and how many millions of families live in poverty in the UK, you'd think that we're talking about a conflict-ridden country. You'd think we're talking about a third world, backward, underdeveloped, riddled by dictatorships but we're talking about Great Britain, we're talking about the UK. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And I think that this is, I might be focusing on the UK for examples, but this is what's happening across the world. And it's something that I think is leading to more conflict. It's leading to more injustice. The reason why, for instance, we touched on Syria and why it is that the Assad regime, for instance, are being rehabilitated within the international fold. It's about interests. Why is it that we have regimes that have committed horrendous crimes that we acknowledge, we know, we wrote, we read in our own media, yet they're being given the red carpet treatment whenever and the reason is interests. And I recall when Donald Trump was pressed on a meeting that he was going to have with the Saudi king, and he was reminded by several journalists about the fact that he himself had accused the Crown Prince of murdering Jamal Khashoggi. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to leave the $500 billion contracts to the Russians? So essentially what he said, and to be perfectly honest, I would love it for leaders to be as blunt as he was back then. And basically what he said was, listen, it was horrible what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but you know what? Money is more valuable. Jobs, contracts, and the such. If that is something that we as people, if we don't stand up to, and the challenge that we rise to face, I fear that we're going to come to very, very grim, very, very desperate, very, very difficult days ahead. And it might be difficult to imagine more grim, more difficult, more conflict-ridden, but it definitely will be.
So if we bring this back to the priorities of anyone listening to this, it will be to strive for justice and to be good.
I think it's everyone's pursuit. And, if Muslims are driven either by their faith or by their sense of right and wrong, or by their system or their values and the such, then fine. But whatever it is, it's something we need to face, each from our different perspective.
Yeah. Dr. Anas, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been incredibly enriching.
Thank you.
Sorry if we tired you out for speaking so much, but thank you once again for your time, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you very much, Razan. It's been lovely. Thank you.